Welcome to this video. This is the Muller UN seminar and you will watch the flipped activities for week 5. The main research question for this semester is: why are developing countries still poor? Well, the answer to this question might surprise you, and I know it might also create some interesting debate. My answer, one of my answers, is international aid. This is what we're going to cover in the next couple of weeks. So we will look at international aid depending on the decades that the aid was given. And today we will start with international aid in the 1960s. What's international aid? Well, I decided to go for actually the official definition. I simplified it a little bit, but hopefully we'll get into the details of the definition a bit later. So I am using the definition of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. According to the OECD, and actually the OECD has a Special Development Assistance Committee, DAC, international aid can also be called the Official Development Assistance, ODA. I am focusing on the goal of the ODA right now. We will see other aspects later on. So the goal of the Official Development Assistance is the promotion of the economic development and welfare of developing countries. And I am happy to see economic development, even happier to see welfare, but you will see in the next couple of weeks that even though this is the goal, this is not what has been achieved. International aid has not helped with economic development and welfare. So, the promotion of the economic development and welfare of developing countries. So, clearly there is no military missions included in international aid. Anything connected to the army is not considered international aid. In addition, since usually peacekeeping missions are military type missions or army type missions, they are also not included. But on the website they make the exception. They say that if some specific activities aimed at development, so activities that will help development, are included in peacekeeping missions, they may be counted as international aid. Surprisingly, nuclear energy can be counted as international aid, but only if it's for civilian purposes. So again, if it's military, no, nuclear energy is not counted. I was quite happy to see also that cultural programs can be considered as international aid, because as we've seen before, I believe that development is not just a matter of money. Money is important, but it is not everything. Something that some of you might want to look into is what the OECD exactly means by cultural capacities. From the top of my head, I would say obviously traditions, but also I'm wondering about education. Because of what I've been saying, you might not be too surprised to see that my definition of international aid is actually a famous saying: the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Studying international aid supports my claim in the sense that the good intentions are there. Yes, developed or richer countries want to help poor countries, but the result, hell, that is a place that is not very pleasant to be, a place where people suffer, is connected to the fact that even if we have been wanting to help poor countries, we haven't been able to help them. And in some situations in some countries, actually their life became worse, not any better. And I decided to use two African countries as my examples, Zambia and Botswana. I wanted to point out right from the beginning that Zambia and Botswana are actual neighbors. Besides the fact that Zambia and Botswana are neighbors, I also find their economic situations quite interesting, and I'm doing the air quotation right now because it's interesting in the sense of what we learned, not anything to be happy about. So if we look, I started this graph in the 1960s and I finished it about in 2014, I believe. Zambia was actually doing not so bad, right? But then it started going down, slowly but surely. And then since 2000, there seems to be a slight improvement. On the other hand, Botswana started at a very low level, but its progress has been very steady and upward. So the situation in Botswana has been getting better. So how come two neighbors can have such different destinies, such different situations? Well, one reason is international aid. Let me show you. As you probably recognize, this is a map of the African continent, and we have here Botswana and right there Zambia. As I said, one of the reasons explaining why Botswana and Zambia economic situations are so different is international aid. As you see here, Botswana only depends on international aid at a level of 27%, whereas Zambia depends at a level of 84%. The percentage represents how much of the government expenditures, so meaning the government spending, it's a percentage of the government spending, and the data is for 2008. So if we look again at the graph of the gross domestic product per capita of Zambia and Botswana, and we use the 2008 information we just looked at, yes, Zambia depends on international aid at a level of 84%, and look where their GDP is, whereas Botswana only depends on international aid at a level of 27%, and look how they're doing in terms of GDP. So yes, it seems, and it's not just for these two countries, that the trend is the more a country depends on international aid, the less the economy of the country is a good one. So it seems like a lot of developing countries, when they depend on international aid, when they rely a lot on international aid, cannot manage to have a good economy. To be able to explain to you why international aid hasn't been working properly, we'll have to give a short history of aid. So last week it was math class, and this week we add history. So the history starts with the Marshall Plan. And this plan was decided on June 5th, 1947. And it was in my favorite university, Harvard University. And the plan was decided by US Secretary of State George C. Marshall. So that's why the plan has his name, the Marshall Plan. So before I explain it to you, maybe you could do a little bit of guessing work. And if you look at the date, you might be able to guess, if you don't know already, what the Marshall Plan was. If you thought about World War II when you saw the date of 1947, you were right, right? It's 2 years after the end of World War II, in Europe at least. And yes, Europe, all the European countries were pretty much destroyed, especially Germany, part of France, and England was pretty badly hit too. So Europe needed help to rebuild itself, right? To build houses, industries, roads, bridges again. And really, only the US could help out because besides Pearl Harbor, the US had not suffered massive bombing, so their roads, cities, industries were not destroyed. So basically, the Marshall Plan is, or I should say, was a 5-year plan to refinance Europe, right? To give money to Europe so that they could rebuild itself. Here is a map showing you where most of the money went. As you can see, yes, England got quite a bit of it because, as I said, England was heavily bombed by the German army. France is not too far behind, even though the southern part of France was pretty, I can't say protected, but not as badly destroyed as England. The border part of France was pretty badly hit. Italy and yes, Germany was also helped out, but just West Germany. East Germany was under Russian control, so the US was not going to give money to them. So yes, the US really helped European countries to rebuild themselves after World War II. I found some interesting pictures related to the Marshall Plan. So this is in Germany, right? So you have here in German mit Marshallplan Hilfe, which Hilfe is help, and you can see people are building, rebuilding. I'm guessing probably a road, and it looks like something here is happening for a house. Here in French, Bienvenue Monsieur Marshall. So it's the French politician welcoming the Secretary of State, Marshall. And this is going to probably be the best news of the flipped activities for this week. But yes, the Marshall Plan worked really well, right? France and Germany could recover from the war, the UK as well, but I'm more familiar with France and Germany as I'm close to these two countries. And France and Germany actually became the leaders in the construction of the European Union. I really wonder, without the Marshall Plan, could France and Germany have become friends again and worked together to build the European Union to try and avoid another war between European countries? So I think the Marshall Plan was not just about the economy, but probably also for helping peace in Europe. So yes, the Marshall Plan is a great example of a successful aid story. So it was successful. So a couple years later, in the 1960s, meaning the rich developed countries, decided that they should give the same type of help to African countries. So a way to summarize what the 1960s international aid was is to say financial capital. So as what happened in Europe, they gave money to African countries so that African countries would start developing with large-scale industrial projects, right? So large-scale industrial projects, you have to think roads, big roads, or in this specific case, since I'm using the example of Zambia, I thought I would show you the dam that was built on Lake Kariba between Zambia and Zimbabwe. So this dam was built to produce electricity. So it's called a hydroelectric dam. So here are some pictures of the dam while it was being built in black and white and what it looks like nowadays. So yes, Zambia and Zimbabwe used the money they were given to build a large-scale industrial project here, a hydroelectric dam. As we just saw with the dam between Zambia and Zimbabwe, yes, some large-scale industrial projects started and finished, but most were mainly on paper. On paper means that they had the projects written on paper and probably people even signed documents, but the projects never became a reality. But at the beginning of the 1970s, the rich countries, the countries which had been giving the money to the developing countries, realized that there was not much progress made in terms of infrastructures. Infrastructures are the things you have once the large-scale industrial projects are finished. So in the case of Zambia and Zimbabwe, it's the hydroelectric dam. And just to help you see that the situation hasn't gotten much better, even closer to the present time, I'll take the example of Zambia again. And in a survey between 2001 and 2006, they found that only 20% of households have electricity. 20%. So this is a very low level of development in terms of infrastructures, and yet infrastructures can be at least a major handicap, so a major problem for productivity, right? Just try to imagine what it's like to make a product if electricity is not available, or if electricity, comes and goes. So sometimes you have electricity, sometimes you don't have electricity. So it can be a real problem for productivity. And studies have also shown that infrastructure can be a trigger, so something that will help growth. Right? So I'll show you two graphs to get my point across in a more convincing way. So as I just said, right, taking the example of electricity, we see here in a few African countries that, yes, electricity can be a really big issue in terms of productivity. In Botswana, that we used earlier to show how much better they were doing compared to Zambia, we still realize that even though they're doing better, they're still fighting with some basic needs such as electricity, right? It's close to, I would say, 78% of their problems related to productivity comes from the lack of electricity. Very similar situation in Swaziland and Namibia, and yes, Zambia as well. It's above 40% for electricity, and transport comes next, and then ICT, right? So ICT here, information and communication technology. Right? So if we focus on Zambia. So this is the type of infrastructure, electricity, transport, and access to technology, or technologies actually, that make production a problem for companies. In terms of growth, right, so getting better, or the percentage that we see here on the side, again, if the infrastructures were fixed, what some analysts say is that the country could really improve, right? So for Zambia, the telecom industry, so technology, being able to communicate, if it could get better, it would help the growth, the economic growth of the country increase by almost 2%, and then another about 1% for roads, right? So having good roads so that you can send your product or receive material to make your product. Right? So transportation, roads are important forms of infrastructure as well. So yes, some large-scale industrial projects started, but most were mainly on paper. Why? Well, if you think about it, the 1960s aid to African countries was just using what worked in Europe. But Europe as a continent and Africa as a continent are very different. Their contexts are different, and the conditions also related to the aid are very different. So when you help, you always need to think in terms of context. You cannot apply something that worked in one country and just use it in another country without taking into consideration the specific situation of the country. To try and explain the different contexts and conditions between Europe and Africa, I have three things to point out. The first one is that European countries didn't depend entirely on aid. European countries, even though they were destroyed, they were slowly but surely recovering, right? So they also had their own economies to count on, so money that they were making on their own. So that's why I'm saying European countries didn't depend entirely on aid. It was not their only way to get money into the economy to recover from the war. And some have made math regarding this situation, and it looked like Europe, the aid represented only 2.5% of the GDP. And actually it's a maximum, right? And I believe France, it might have been slightly lower because we were less destroyed. But if you look at the situation in Africa, and again, this is an average, so it might be slightly higher. I would love to have the median for these numbers, but they're not available. So on average, the aid in Africa represents 15% of GDP. Remember, this is in the 1960s, right? The map I showed you at the beginning was for 2008, so the situation got worse, right? But back in the 1960s, the aid represented 15% of the GDP. So the context here is very clearly different between Europe and Africa. My next point is connected to the conditions. Right? The Marshall Plan had a very specific and short time limit. Right? Specific is 5 years, and 5 years in terms of monetary support is quite short. Right? So with this very specific and limited time, people had to make it work. People had to do their best to make sure that this help would really help them. Right? So they had a higher motivation to get it to work. On the other hand, the conditions for African countries are much more relaxed. And as much as I like being relaxed, in this case, this is not a good thing. For instance, in the 1960s, aid in Africa had no time limit. So this leads to situations where governments have no reason to think about long-term financial planning. They're only thinking short-term. Well, when we don't have enough money anymore, we ask for more. So they were not thinking long-term, they were just thinking short-term. And short-term financial planning usually is very bad for the economy in general. People have to think at least 10 to 15 years ahead. Also, because of that very easy money, at least money easy to get, why should the governments try to find other ways to pay for development? Just go ahead and cash the checks from the rich countries, right? Get the money connected to the checks sent by the rich countries. So no motivation to think long-term, and long-term is what is necessary for good financial planning, and no reason to think about other ways to pay for development. And going back to the context, you have to, and probably this is not too hard to imagine, is that Europe before the war was a thriving place, right? It was not a poor part of the world. European countries had institutions that they needed to develop. So, for instance, public services, City Hall, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, all these public services, right, that the government gives. Also, they had well-run businesses. Germany had some bad economic times, and that's why Hitler came to power. But in other European countries, things were doing pretty well on the business side. And again, the legal and social institutions were pretty efficient, right? So anything connected to justice, that's for the legal, and social institution, anything that would bring society as a whole, so thinking education and health. So if we look at Europe, the Marshall Plan was really rebuilding, right? Something was there before, the war destroyed it, and they needed help to rebuild it. But in Africa, in most African countries, you didn't have such sufficient political, economical, and physical framework. You didn't have the experienced public services, the well-run businesses, and the efficient legal and social institutions. That framework, politics, economy, and infrastructure, like the physical, this creates a framework. This is what is necessary for aid to work on a rebuilding basis. But in the case of Africa, because you didn't have this framework, it was building. And building political and social institutions requires more than just cash. It requires people, and I will add well-educated people. And as we will see, education in many African countries was not as best as it could be. So, the 1960s aid to developing countries, and we've been focusing on African countries, was financial capital, so money, for large-scale industrial projects. This idea came from the success of the Marshall Plan in Europe, so they thought that because it worked in Europe, it should work somewhere else, but they didn't think about the fact that Europe and Africa have very different contexts. In addition, the conditions to receive the money were very different in Europe and in Africa. So this explains why the 1960s international aid was not a success. International aid in the 1960s, this is the end of the flipped activities. Regarding references, I wanted to point out that my main source of information is a fascinating, very interesting book by Moyo Dambisa. It was in 2009. It's called Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. So yes, I will cover the better way, right? We're just looking right now at what has not been working. Thank you very much.